Welcome to the best time of the whole week, Saturday morning. The rush of the workaday world is in the past. Monday still hasn't reared its ugly head. And this is the one day you can just sit back and relax, if even for just a moment. And one of the ways I love to relax on Saturday morning is with a nice, hot, frothy cappuccino. Somehow, through divine providence, no doubt, you have stumbled into this little corner of the internet and have discovered this podcast, Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints. Because after all, who better to share a cup of coffee with than one of the uncountable number of saints from our tradition? Each week, we set aside a little bit of time to discuss the saint of the week, or two. Some weeks are packed, as well as explore any major festivals of the Christian tradition coming up or just celebrated. I've always been a history nerd, and church history, especially with the stories and lives of the saints, are a continual source of inspiration. I hope you enjoy this little respite from the normal grind. And now, sit back, pour yourself a nice frothy cappuccino or the drink of your choice. Don't worry, no one checks. And enjoy. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel if you want to continue to see our content. And remember to hit the notification bell to be alerted to new videos. And so now, on to this week's episode. Happy feast day of St. Francis. We see that St. Francis, as he's enjoying his cappuccino, has a couple furry friends to join him today on Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints. St. Francis is one of the most beloved saints, if not the most beloved, maybe with the exception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, of all the saints. Everybody loves St. Francis. Catholics love St. Francis, Protestants love St. Francis, even secular people and atheists, they love St. Francis. He's been adopted by everybody over the years because his story is so touching and moving. And also, I believe, to be perfectly honest, because of his love for animals. We all love animals. My wife and I have always had dogs, and so St. Francis touches something in all of us that just draws us to him. But his life story is incredibly interesting. And he's more of a radical saint than I think a lot of people today realize. And he's got a very interesting life story. So I think you're going to enjoy today's episode of Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints. One other thing, it's going to go a little long today, and I've always promised that I don't want this to be a 2-cup show, only one. So we're going to be talking about spiritual beings as part of our discussion of angels after St. Michael's Day. That will be on a bonus episode. The angel discussion will be on a bonus episode that will be released on Wednesday. So this morning, we're going to just be all about Francis. You make a list of the top most popular saints in the world. Saint Francis is going to be up at the top. And I'm going to use this as an example. How many people that really don't know much about St. Francis or really aren't even religious, but how many people have a St. Francis statue in their garden? I mean, you see them all over the place. My wife and I have two, one in the front yard, one in the backyard. He is just an incredibly popular and appealing saint. And he's one of the few that I can think of that he was incredibly popular in the 12th century, and I think his popularity continues to grow over the centuries. He's probably as popular today as he was in the 1200s. So St. Francis is going to be an interesting discussion this morning. One of the things my wife and I look forward to every year is that every year our church and millions of churches around the world on the feast day of St. Francis have a blessing of the animals event. It's great fun. Now, one of the things I know Mary and I always are slightly concerned about, Truffle gets very excited, our little half Pomeranian, half Papillon dog. She gets very excited at the St. Francis Day, but we never quite know how she's going to react. But this is a great tradition, and I actually think, just as a note to churches out there, I think it's a great way as an outreach to the community to draw people in. That people love their pets. People have a very strong connection to their animals, and they want to involve them in their lives. And how better than to have them blessed on St. Francis Day? So if you get a chance, if your church or one in your area offers a blessing of the animals today, take little Fido or Spot out to get them blessed. It's only appropriate that we open today's discussion of St. Francis with his most famous prayer, the prayer of St. Francis. Millions of people know and love this prayer. It's stitched on a million pillows throughout the world, and people have it hanging and framed in their house, and it's just it's a beloved prayer, and I think it speaks to the soul of Saint Francis, his message, and so as I read the prayer, let those words soak down deep and really absorb what Saint Francis is praying for and how he's calling us to live. Let us pray. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. I have a short little video I'm going to play that kind of gives you an overview of St. Francis's life. He's a big saint, one of the biggest, and there's going to be a lot of topics we're going to cover today. But I thought this little video did a good job of kind of giving an overview of St. Francis's life. So enjoy.
Saint Francis is one of the world's most popular and beloved saints. He is the patron of animals, merchants, and ecology. Francis was born in Assisi, Italy in 1181 to wealthy parents. His father was a silk merchant who nicknamed his son Francis after France, a nation and culture which he admired. Francis enjoyed a comfortable youth and had many friends. He himself said that he lived in sin during his teenage years. As a young man, Francis thirsted for glory. While setting out to join the Fourth Crusade, God spoke to Francis and told him to return home. Francis was humiliated, but he obeyed. Later, when he encountered a leper, Francis was moved with compassion and he gave the man a kiss as a sign of peace. Afterwards, the man vanished. Francis concluded God had been testing him. The final moment of conversion came when Francis visited a dilapidated church, and he heard God ask him to rebuild the church. Francis assumed God wanted him to rebuild the church he was praying in, so he stole money and cloth from his father to do it. Enraged, Francis's father took his son to the bishop and sued him for the money. The bishop ordered Francis to repay it, and Francis responded by renouncing his inheritance and his family and dedicating his life to serving the poor. Francis took to the streets and lived day to day, relying on God to provide. As he went about, he cared for the sick and the poor. Francis became legendary for his compassion. It said he could talk to the animals. Followers flocked to Francis, and he established an order of monks. Today it is the Franciscan Order. Francis lived a life so holy he was canonized just 2 years after his death. Today, St. Francis intercedes on behalf of faithful Catholics around the world, and a great number of miracles are attributed to his name.
This is a picture of St. Francis's house that he grew up in. He has a very interesting youth. You see almost a little hint of St. Augustine's youth in St. Francis. He had a pretty wild upbringing. He was born to a very wealthy man, Pietro de Bernardine del Marconi, who was a prosperous silk merchant. I guess the equivalent today is, let's say, his dad owned a Lexus dealership. I mean, this if you were a silk merchant in the 12th century, you were dealing in luxury goods, and Francis, as the son of a very wealthy merchant, by all accounts, very handsome, very showy, was living the high life. His mother was French. She came from the Provence in France, and Francis lived pretty much the high-spirited life that you would expect the son of a wealthy silk merchant to live. He spent money lavishly. He was involved with the troubadours, which were a traveling group of musicians. So you can imagine the modern day equivalent of St. Francis was in a band. You know, how many teenagers are in bands. He spent money lavishly, had lots of friends, wore bright clothing. So this was the path Francis was on early in life. But it all came to a change when Francis was selling cloth for his dad, and a beggar came and asked him for alms. And Francis abandoned his wares and ran after the beggar and gave him all the money that he had. And his dad didn't look too kindly on this and mocked him for being overly generous and maybe a little bit of a fool. But he was no fool. I think Francis took the words of the Lord seriously when he said that, you know, the people who come to you, the poor, the indigent, that looking at them, you're looking in the eyes of Christ. And I think that's where Francis was coming from. Another famous story involving Francis's early life is that when he came across a beggar, and this beggar, you know, was begging for alms, and his clothes were all ragged and dirty and disheveled, and Francis changed clothes with the beggar. And again, this set him into a conflict with his father, who thought that Francis was not behaving like the son of a wealthy silk merchant should behave. But Francis already, you can see, was being called to a higher purpose by God. Here's an image of Francis you don't normally associate with him, but it's part of his past, that he was a soldier, like many young men of his age. Around 1202, Francis joined a military expedition against Perugia and was taken as a prisoner. He spent a year as a captive. And while he was a captive, he had some kind of illness that caused Francis to reevaluate his life. And he had a vision, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But upon his return to Assisi in 1203, Francis returned to his carefree life. But there's something about his experience when he was held captive in this war that haunted Francis and set a new trajectory for his life. Later biographies of Francis kind of filled in the gaps a little bit on this vision that he had while he was a prisoner. And Francis remained troubled after his return from being a POW in the war with Perugia, and like many young men of his age, he was expected to get married. And a friend of his was asking whether he had any prospects or who he was thinking of marrying, and he said, "Yes, a fairer bride than any of you have ever seen, Lady Poverty." So Francis was already on his path of renunciation and on his road to sainthood at this date. I can't help but contrast Francis's approach to Christianity with what I think is a modern day heresy, the prosperity gospel. Francis is the anti-prosperity gospel preacher. The preaching that says that God wants you to be rich. Well, I think Francis would probably disapprove of that. He chose a life of just extreme asceticism, and that should cut us a little bit, and make us reevaluate what we think is important in life. This next incident in St. Francis's early life really marks the dividing line between his old life and his new life and his new path. When he was out on his travels, he came across a leper. Now, leprosy in the 12th century, it was an incurable disease. People were just, if you saw a leper, you fled. You certainly would not embrace them or touch them. In fact, in many towns and communities, lepers were required to ring a bell as they were walking, so that they were warning people to stay away. But Francis saw this leper, and contrary to all social norms at the time, went up and embraced this leper. And then, according to his later biographies, the leper disappeared. And Francis took this as a sign that God was calling him to a different life. And this is really where Francis makes his break from his rich, spoiled past, and set him on his new path towards sainthood. What you're looking at here is the cross of the crucifix of San Damiano. It's probably a reproduction. I don't think it's the original, but it's in the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, and it relates to this famous story about St. Francis that really is the beginning of his mission. After his encounter with the beggar, St. Francis decided to go on to a pilgrimage to Rome, which was very common at that time. And he was begging at St. Peter's Basilica to give alms to the poor. And when he returned home, he was in the area around Assisi, in the little chapel of San Damiano. And the chapel had come into severe neglect and was falling down. And as he was praying before the icon of the crucifix of San Damiano that you see, illustrated here, a voice came to him and said, "Francis, Francis, go and repair my church, which, as you can see, is falling into ruins." Now, Francis took this to mean the specific church, and not the church overall. And he went home. His father was a very wealthy silk merchant, and took a couple bales of silk and sold them to get money to rebuild the church, and to give to the priest that was at San Damiano. The priest was not amused by this, and didn't want to take the ill-gotten gain, since St. Francis essentially had taken this from his father. But this was the beginning of really St. Francis's ministry, and it signifies the beginning of the final break with his father. Here's an early Renaissance painting of the event of St. Francis selling the silk to gather money for his mission. He also sold the horse. So when he went home and not only had sold the silk from under his father, but also the horse, things didn't get really good with Dad after that. Things really come to a head with the conflict between Francis and his father, who I'll be honest with you, I could sympathize with a little. I mean, if you're the owner of a Lexus dealership and your son sells a bunch of your inventory and gives the money all away without asking you, I can understand you being a little peeved by that. I mean, I can get that, but he totally is the bad guy in the story and totally overreacts. Francis, he had his son, he recovered the money from the priest that had gotten the money and didn't want to take it because he knew it had come from from this source, but he had his son beaten and imprisoned in his house. His mother let him out, and then he went and hid in a cave. But Francis's father then called him before the bishop and sued his own son, and to force him to renounce his inheritance. He was so enraged by this. Francis, according to his biographers, then stripped himself of all possessions, including his cloak, leaving himself completely naked. This painting shows Francis being enveloped in the robe of the bishop, and renounced his old life. And I think Francis's story and his renunciation of all worldly goods really harkens back to a story in the gospel that they just talked about in church just a couple weeks ago. The story of the rich young ruler, where he comes to Jesus and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, follow the law of the prophets. He says, "I've done all these things." He goes, "There's one more thing you need to do in order to be perfect. Go sell all that you have, give to the poor, and come and follow me." And the rich young ruler went away sad because he had many possessions. And that story strikes a lot of Christians. It troubles them. I mean, it should. It troubled the apostles, who then said, "Who then can be saved?" And Jesus said, "With God, all things are possible." But Francis is one of those rare individuals that are called to a particular type of holiness that took this story to heart. And he lived this story. He did give all he had, all his possessions away to the poor. And his whole life is an illustration of that gospel story. For the next several months, Francis wandered around as a beggar in the hills behind Assisi, begging for stones to rebuild these chapels that had fallen into disrepair. He worked as a scullery. He went and worked with lepers in a hospital, and really had just given himself over to this mission that he had. These stones that he kept begging from people to rebuild these chapels kind of started to draw attention to him, and is part of the charm, I think, of St. Francis. A couple of them that are still very important. San Pietro in Spina was one of the chapels that he rebuilt. You can go see the rebuilt chapel there that's turned into a church. St. Mary of the Angels was another of the churches that he rebuilt. So St. Francis is on his mission from that voice that he heard in front of the crucifix of San Damiano to rebuild the church. During this time, he also worked at a leper hospital, which was very dangerous occupation. I mean, there was no cure, and Francis was right there, on the front lines. And I was trying to think of, a modern day equivalent of this. And I kept thinking of Mother Teresa, who went to the poorest of the poor in India and worked with them. And I think that she is somebody who was embodying that spirit of St. Francis in our modern day. Here's a picture of San Damiano Church today obviously, the repair started under St. Francis and continued on, and from a small chapel, this fairly substantial church grew. So you can go to Italy today and see it. One morning in February 1208, Francis was taking part in Mass in the chapel of St. Mary of the Angels, one of the chapels that he had rebuilt, and he was living in a hut nearby. And the gospel that day was the commissioning of the 12 from the book of Matthew. That's where Jesus' disciples are commissioned to go forth and proclaim that the kingdom of God is at hand. Francis was inspired by this and decided to devote his life to poverty and to serving the Lord. He had taken his wooden tunic and tied a rope around what we commonly see as St. Francis's, robe and tie. That was the robe and tie of the poor in Umbria, where Francis lived. And he took that as to be his dress. We so associate that look with St. Francis, but he took it from the poor of Umbria. His example started to attract people. Like, who is this guy out there building churches on his own with begging stones and renouncing, all worldly goods? And he, over time, within a year, he had kind of gotten about 11 followers together, and they kind of formed their own little group. They were working in a deserted leper colony of Rivo Torto that was near Assisi, and they were helping the lepers. They were continuing to build the chapels, and this was the beginning of the Franciscans. So Francis and his 11 followers eventually decided to go to Rome to see Pope Innocent III and to get recognition for what they were forming into a new order, like the Benedictines and the Dominicans later, that they would be a new order, and they needed permission from the Pope to form this new order. They had taken on a new order called the Regula Primitive, or the Primitive Rule, which came from the following verses in the Bible: to follow the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and to walk in His footsteps. They had a vow of poverty and chastity and total obedience, and this is the order that they wanted to found. So they went to Rome, and now you would think, now here's 12 guys going to go in to see the most powerful man in Europe at the time. I don't know how this is going to go, but actually things kind of went better than you would expect. They ran into Cardinal Guido from Assisi, who was sympathetic to their plight. He also happened to be confessor to Innocent III, so they sort of had a little bit of an inside track. And he said that he would go present the case to the Pope to have a new order founded. The Pope heard the case from Cardinal Guido and was largely sympathetic, but basically said, hey, these are 12 guys. Come back when you have more people. I mean, I can totally sympathize with Pope Innocent's opinion there. And so they were a little disappointed, but they were going to get ready to leave. The Pope did agree to have them tonsured. That tonsuring means you see monks have the top of their head shaved. That means that they are officially not an official order, but they're sanctioned by the church, that the church knows about them and that they're not heretics, which will come in handy later on, as you'll see. But they were getting ready to leave, but then something rather dramatic happened. What happened has been portrayed in art many, many times, including this painting that you're seeing right here from the 14th century. It's the dream of Innocent III. And what Innocent dreamt is that he dreamt that the Basilica of St. John Lateran, which was the papal palace, the main church in Rome other than St. Peter's, was falling down. Actually, that's the official seat of the Bishop of Rome. Was falling down. But what was holding it up was a tiny little monk. One monk was holding it up. And he took this to mean, since he had just heard about St. Francis's order the day before, that this is God telling him that, hey, these are the guys that are gonna hold the church up. And it was a prophetic dream that actually is largely true. It was the Franciscan Order that formed at this point and continues today that has really held the church up through some very difficult and trying times when it was really collapsing due to its own corruption a lot of times. So because of this dream, Pope Innocent III had a change of heart and called Francis back in. So to Francis's surprise, and I'm sure his companions, they're suddenly granted an audience with the Pope. And the Pope has approved of their order and officially sanctioned it. So from now on, there is a new order of monks in the world, the Franciscans. After approval from the Pope, Francis's little order grew quickly, attracting followers all throughout central Italy. Uh, and it wasn't just men, it wasn't just monks. Eventually, Clare of Assisi, a young nobleman, was attracted to Francis's teaching. And on Palm Sunday, on March 28th, 1212, Claire left her similar background, actually, very wealthy young woman, left her family and wanted to join Francis's order. She then, with Francis's assistance, started the Sisters of the Poor Clares, which is the female equivalent of the Franciscan Order for nuns. She is an amazing woman herself and a great saint, and I'm sure we will do a special on her one day. Um, Interestingly enough, St. Clare, is the patron saint of the internet. So I'm not exactly sure why, but she is. So you have St. Clare to thank for being able to hear this broadcast today. Both Francis and Claire, their lives have been inspiration for many artists over the years. And one of the more popular subjects is Claire's profession, which you see here, where she's having her hair cut as she takes her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. You'll see many paintings that'll say St. Claire's profession, where she is giving up her old life and taking on a new and holy calling. Francis's reputation as a peacemaker started early. And if you remember back to his early life, where he was a soldier as a youth, it illustrates an issue we sometimes forget about Italy at this time, that there was constant warfare always going on between the various Italian city-states. Italy was different than a lot of the other countries of Europe at that time, to where it was just a mishmash of independent city-states that were constantly at war with one another. And one of them, Siena, like many of the city-states, was constantly being plagued by factional violence and political groups and families. It's like almost like a giant illustration of The Sopranos. Okay, I mean that's kind of like what Italy was like in the 12th century and the 13th century, and this constant warfare was causing all kinds of problems. And then, according to tradition, Saint Francis arrived in Siena during one of these periods of unrest. And rather than confronting the fighters with force, he confronted them with hymns and singing psalms. And his reputation already for holiness was inspiring to others. And just his mere presence and his preaching was able to calm the riots and bring the city some, at long last, at least temporary peace. This next story about Francis, you got to hand it to him for this. He is a brave individual, because this seems like a suicide mission. During Francis's time, the Crusades were going on. The Crusades lasted for about 200 years. The First Crusade in 1099 was really the one that gained most of the land for the Crusader states. And all the Crusades after that were all just defensive actions that slow but sure decline. And by Francis's time, we were up to the Fifth Crusade. So, and each crusade was slightly worse than the one before. So the Crusades were not going well. During the Fifth Crusade in 1219, everything had shifted to Egypt at that point. And that's Francis decided to go by himself to convert the Sultan of Egypt, who was the nephew of Saladin, The guy's name was Al-Qamin. So he was the nephew of Saladin. And so he was going to go on his own to convert the Sultan or to be martyred. Either way, that was his mission. And he did go to the Holy Land. He did go to get a meeting with the Sultan, and it's very interesting what happened. It's not exactly what you would expect. I can only imagine what the Muslim forces thought of this lone, bedraggled, monk in tattered clothes coming up and saying that he wants to have an audience with the Sultan to discuss Christianity. I mean, I'm sure they thought he was crazy, but maybe because they thought he was crazy, they kind of gave him a little bit of leeway. And Francis did get an audience with the Sultan, according to tradition. And one of the things he said to the Sultan is he offered a deal. And the deal was, and it's illustrated in multiple paintings, including this one called The Trial by Fire. And the deal was that Francis offered to walk through the fire, and if he was unharmed, that the Sultan would convert to Christianity. And that if the Sultan's, one of the Sultan's people, imams, took the challenge, if he walked through the fire and was unharmed to prove the truth of Islam, then Francis would convert, and he would go and convert the Christians to Islam. The Sultan was bemused by this. He decided to not take Francis up on the offer. But they did have a rather long conversation for several days. And it's interesting that it's not really recorded what Francis and the Sultan, talked about. I mean, some stories have said that the Sultan converted to Christianity on his deathbed and whatnot. I'm not necessarily buying that. But a couple things are inarguably true, is that the Muslim forces that were in the Holy Land at that time gave the Franciscans somewhat of a blank check. They were allowed, of all of them, none of the other orders were really allowed to operate within Muslim lands. They were able to go and come freely with Jerusalem. So Francis's bravery did inspire the Pope and did allow the Franciscans to have a presence in the Holy Land. That presence continues. Here's a picture of the Franciscan Order that's in Jerusalem today. Actually, the Franciscans, of all the orders, are the only one that have been allowed to be throughout the Holy Land because of this famous meeting between the Sultan and Francis 800 years ago. We don't know exactly what was said, but I think there was a feeling of mutual respect. The Sultan was impressed by Francis's bravery, and saw him as, he didn't agree with his religion, but did see him as a holy man and somebody that should be respected. So we have Francis to thank for the fact that the Franciscans have been in the Holy Land from that point to today. One thing Francis is definitely known for is his love of animals and his special bond with animals. They come from a couple stories, but this is one of them. The Wolf of Gubia. And this is the story, whether it's an apocryphal story or a legendary story, or there's truth to it, but it's solid in that this has been always associated with Francis. Is that there was, in the town of Gubia, there was a wolf that was attacking sheep and attacking farmers and just causing all kinds of havoc. And when Francis came into that area, he agreed to go talk to the wolf. And the wolf, according to legend, listened to Francis, and Francis proposed a pact that the wolf was hungry, and so that if the townspeople would agree to feed the wolf on a regular basis, the wolf would stop attacking the villagers and their livestock. And to show his agreement to this, the wolf supposedly bowed his head and laid it on Francis's hand. This is a charming story. It's been portrayed in multiple paintings over the years, and it's one of the reasons that Francis has always been associated, especially with animals. Another famous story that associates St. Francis with animals is his famous sermon to the birds. And according to the story, Francis and his companions were traveling around Assisi, and they came upon a flock of birds. The birds didn't fly away as they approached, and Francis then went and preached to the birds, who appeared to listen. And he preached to them to always be grateful and always sing the praises of God. And the birds, seemingly understanding this, bowed their heads and opened their beaks. And only after Francis gave them permission did they fly off. And this story, which has been illustrated numerous times, is yet another reason that St. Francis is associated with animals and also with ecology. Here's something you may not know is associated with St. Francis, but if you are like me, when it's Christmas and you put up your Christmas decorations, one of the things that we put up, and we have a collection of them, so we put them all over the house. But we put up a nativity scene, with Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus and the animals and the shepherds, and even adding in the three kings. Well, that came the first person recorded to create a nativity scene, a live nativity scene, illustrating this the story from the Bible is St. Francis. So he is associated with creating the first nativity scene. So at Christmas, when you're putting up your nativity scene or your crutch under your tree or on your table in your living room, think of St. Francis. You can thank him. I think a slight deviation from St. Francis to bring up this point, because it involves nativity scenes. When Christmas comes around and everybody puts up their trees and their decorations on their yard, and you see snowmen and Santa Claus and it's all great. I am pro Christmas, but I think as Christians, we should go back to embracing these nativity scenes as outdoor decorations. I mean, Mary and I have one of those blow mold. It's great. I mean, we love it. One of those old blow mold nativity scenes that we put out in our front yard every Christmas, and I think we're the only ones in the neighborhood that do. And I think that Christmas is an opportunity. It is about the birth of Jesus. It isn't about Santa and snowmen and elves and those things. We'll be talking about St. Nicholas later. He's a great saint, but he isn't the star of Christmas. Jesus is the star of Christmas. So think about this Christmas, maybe getting a nativity scene and putting it on your front yard. I think it might have an evangelistic purpose that you don't recognize. In September 1224, right around the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, which we celebrated just a couple weeks ago, Francis retreated to Mount Laverna in Tuscany for a retreat. I mean, he was exhausted. He was in poor health, and he had a vision, which is illustrated in this painting. He saw a seraph, a six-winged angel. In fact, I think he might be the only person recorded other than Isaiah or Ezekiel, but the only person in relatively modern times to ever see a seraph. And the seraph gave him the stigmata. The stigmata are wounds that are sometimes in the hand, the palms of the hand, sometimes in the feet, sometimes around the head for the crown of thorns, or on the side, the wounds of Christ. Francis kept the secret, not out of shame, but out of humility. But he is the first recorded person to receive the stigmata as a sign of holiness. Francis isn't the only saint to receive the wounds of the stigmata, but he was the first. You have here illustrated a few others that have received it. The woman on the left that you see with the crown of thorns. That's Catherine of Siena. She received the stigmata, and you can see the wound on her hand. Uh, a modern day saint that died in the 20th century, Padre Pio, received the stigmata, and the stigmata was on his hands for years at a time. He had to wear bandages when he was, performing the Eucharist. Here's a picture of him in the upper right-hand corner, and then Saint Rita received the stigmata, but just a wound in her forehead for the crown of thorns. So they are just a couple of the other examples of a rare breed, but saints over the years that have received the wounds of the stigmata. On the evening of October 3rd, 1226, St. Francis died at the age of 44. He was frail, nearly blind. I mean, he lived an incredibly ascetic life, barely eating, living in extreme poverty, and his body was just worn out from fasting, stillness. He could barely see, but he remained strong to the end in spirit. He was laid on the bare ground, stripped of his habit so that he could die in complete poverty, just as Christ had. And he recited Psalm 142 as he died. I cried to the Lord with my voice and sang praises to God with his last breath. He was surrounded by the brothers of his monastery that had grown dramatically during his lifetime and continued to grow after his death. Francis welcomed death, not with fear, but with joy. And he called it sister death, a term from his Canticle of the Creatures, embracing it as part of God's creation. Witnesses say that a lark, a bird associated with joy and simplicity, and hearkening back to his sermon to the birds, circled the chapel at the moment of his passing, as if nature itself were mourning and celebrating. He died at 44. He was bearing the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, which had appeared 2 years earlier. His body was buried in Assisi, and within 2 years he was canonized by Gregory IX. His tomb became a pilgrimage site, and the Basilica of St. Francis was built in his honor, which is there to today. But Francis's death wasn't the end of his life. That was just almost the beginning of his mission. It was a legacy that continued to grow throughout Europe, throughout the Holy Land, and to today. The Franciscans have an enormous impact on Christianity and our culture. Many things are associated with St. Francis. You know, every saint is usually the patron saint of something. Francis is the patron saint of a few things. One, but everybody knows this one, I started out with it, is that St. Francis is the patron saint of animals. Pope Francis, who took his name from Francis and was the first pope to use that name, declared that Francis of Assisi was the patron saint of ecologists. And this is one of the reasons that he is, because of his association with nature and the natural world and taking care of God's creatures, he remains a popular saint even within the secular world. But he is the patron saint of ecology and ecologists. And because he is so beloved in his home country of Italy, he is the patron saint of Italy. Here's a picture of the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi today. I mean, it's a beautiful church, very spectacular. Part of me, though, wonders whether St. Francis would approve of it being so grand, and he might be a little shy about having his name associated with it, but he is a big saint and deserves a big church. So here's the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. There are a few relics of St. Francis at the Basilica, but some of the most interesting ones, I think, are the one that you see in the center and the two on the side hanging up. His tunic and his cassock. I mean, you could just see how threadbare, worn, dirty. There's patches on them. That the stories about the poverty and the asceticism of St. Francis, that it would be easy for us now to say, oh, this is maybe exaggerated. Well, they're not exaggerated. You can see clearly from the clothes that he wore that he truly did walk the walk. He didn't just talk the talk. Because of his immense popularity, St. Francis's tomb in the basilica has become a major pilgrimage site throughout Italy, and it gets millions of visitors every year. St. Francis has been beloved for centuries, and because of that, he has become a very popular subject for artists. Here's a painting painted by Jan van Eyck from 1430 to 1432 called Saint Francis of Assisi Receiving the Stigmata. It's a wonderful painting. Here's a painting by Giovanni Bellini from 1480 entitled Saint Francis in the Desert. Um, I want you to look to your right, and you'll see a little desk. I mean, I love this painting. It is just embrace the sharp lines and clear detail. I mean, it's almost like a photograph. It's so well done. Very technically superior painting. But on the desk, I want you to notice that there's a little skull that's sitting on the desk, and you'll see a lot of paintings a lot of times with Saint Francis holding a skull. That's not uncommon. It's a way of illustrating that person is an ascetic, is thinking about mortality and has given up on the material pleasures of the world. It's also a sign of being in the desert, in the wilderness. When we get to speaking about Saint Jerome, often you'll see Saint Jerome, presented or portrayed where he's holding a skull. So I just thought that was an interesting little Easter egg, so to speak, sitting there on Saint Francis's desk as he's in the desert. You can always spot an El Greco painting. I mean, his style is so unique to him, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful painter. This is from a few years later, another subject matter covering the St. Francis receiving the stigmata. And El Greco painted this from 1585 to 1590. I really like this particular painting of St. Francis, but Giuseppe de Ribera from 1639. I think it captures what, at least in my imagination, is St. Francis's spirit. One, you see his cloak, it's got the patches on it, and he's obviously in poverty, but he's just filled with joy. And that's one of the reasons St. Francis is an inspiration to me, that he is just filled with joy. And the title of this painting is St. Francis of Assisi in Ecstasy. Another painting I really like that's also called St. Francis of Assisi in Ecstasy is by the great Caravaggio from 1595. Is a really beautiful painting. All of Caravaggio's stuff. Nobody does shadow and light better than he did. This painting is called Imitation of Christ, and it is about St. Francis receiving the stigmata, but afterwards, his reflection on it, by Segoli from 1699. Francis continues to inspire artists of all generations and times. He's been a particular popular subject in movies. This is a particularly good one, The Flowers of St. Francis from 1950. This is a still from that painting where Francis is chatting with a little bird that's sitting on his shoulder. Here's a movie poster from the 1961 feature, Francis of Assisi. Again, a very popular subject. He is, I will say, hard to capture in film. I mean, they're all great movies, but they aren't like blockbusters that they should. Francis is almost uncapturable in film, but this was a particularly good one, so I recommend it. Some of you may have remembered the movie Brother Sun Sister Moon. Came out in the early '70s. It was probably one of the more commercially successful films about St. Francis, and it kind of locked into that hippie vibe that was going on at that time. And that's the thing about St. Francis. He has appeals to multiple groups over different areas. I mean, people that are really concerned about the environment, love animals, ascetics, extremely religious people. They all can love St. Francis, and this one was St. Francis being presented to the flower children. And St. Francis continues to inspire artists today. This is a beautiful image that I found on the internet. It's a very interesting. It's Corpus Christi carpet. It's an actual carpet devoted to St. Francis in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And this is a new one. This was just part of an exhibition in 2025. So St. Francis, beloved since the 1200s, is continuing to inspire people even today. There's a reason we went along today. St. Francis is a big saint, and he's had an enormous impact on Christianity and on Western civilization, just in general. And so he was worth devoting a little extra time to. But what are the lessons we can derive from St. Francis? I mean, he's had such an impact on people over the centuries, and disparate people. I mean, everybody seems to get something different out of St. Francis. But I think there's a few things you could derive from St. Francis and take it as lessons from his life. One, he's Exhibit A in the possibility of radical conversion. I mean, you can change your life. You know, I mean, he is an example for all of us to look towards. That our attachments to things of this world that are holding us back, and if we think, well, I can't give things up. Well, look to the example of St. Francis, and I mean, he's going to put us all to shame. It's also, I think he is a rebuke to the thing that is so rampant in our culture, is this love of the material world, of things, of money, I mean, that drives everything. And if anyone's life was an example of just turning their back on that and really living the gospel that Jesus preached to that young rich man, to sell all that you have and give to the poor and come and follow me. Well, Francis is a good example of that. And he should be the one that we see as a hero, not the Elon Musks and the Bill Gates of the world. So he's a rebuke to that. He's also, I think, an example of the freedom that can be derived from simplicity. Francis did not live an ornate life. Quite the opposite. He had now. I mean, it would be a very hard path to follow, the path that Francis followed. But that one painting that I really enjoy so much, The Ecstasy of St. Francis, shows that the joy that he got from just completely basking in the love of God, and there's nothing else that's important. And that's really true. There really is nothing else that's as important as that. He also illustrates the love of his church, of God's church, and that reform is always necessary. Reform is not a one and done thing. The church needed reforming in the 12th century, in the 13th century. It needed reforming in the 16th and 17th century. It needs reform now. It's an ongoing process. And that voice that came out of the crucifix of San Damiano, Francis, rebuild my church. That voice should come to all of us. We should always be reforming and building the church and keeping the heresies away and strengthening the vehicle for proclaiming God's gospel, Jesus' gospel into the world. Um, he also, of course, is an example of our love for animals and of nature. And we're all God's creature. I mean, I like that he would refer to the wolf of Gabio as brother wolf, or the birds as sister birds, or brother sun and sister moon. I mean, he really did see us all as part of an integrated whole, and that we are all God's creatures, and that if you love animals, I mean, you have to love Saint Francis. But lastly, I think I'm really impressed by Francis going alone to evangelize the Sultan in Egypt by himself, and basically, if martyrdom was to be his fate, he was accepting it. Um, we are called to evangelize the world. That includes our Muslim neighbors as well, and that he calls to us to do that as well. That's our calling as well. So there are many things about Saint Francis and his legacy that should inspire us all today. And lastly, I'm going to leave you with my favorite quote of Saint Francis. I mean, of course, I love the Saint Francis prayer, and of course his work with animals and things of that nature. But this quote, I think, sums up Francis the best, and it's really the truth. Preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. And I think Francis is a good example of this. Francis' example of his life, how he lived his life, uh, have probably converted more people to following Jesus than any words he said. And that should be a lesson for us to take as well. So sorry I went long today, but you can see St. Francis is certainly worth it. Come back Wednesday. Hopefully you've subscribed, and you will see a new video on Wednesday where we're going to talk about the Elohim, and we're going to continue our study of angels. It was just too much to put that all in today. So thanks for joining me this morning. Thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. Next week, we'll be exploring yet another hero from our Christian past. So be sure to tune in. Until then, keep your faith warm, your cappuccino hot and frothy, and have a great week. See you next week for another Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints.